In 2012, Intelligent Systems was prepared to let go of the Fire Emblem series. A critically successful series that lasted for 13 games, including remakes. Awakening was developed as a swan song after 22 years of strategy development. So you can imagine the surprise of Intelligent Systems when the Nintendo overlord said to them, "Hey, make another one." The runaway success of Awakening was a major shock to Nintendo. It proved that under the right conditions, Fire Emblem was primed to be their next A-list series, and they were willing to back Team Emblem if they could make lightning strike twice. Thus began a new golden age for the Fire Emblem series. Well, at least in a financial context. Awakening was so stupid successful that it single-handedly saved the series from ruin, and brought in a new wave of fans. Debatably, a new following large enough to eclipse the existing population. This led to a heated divide in the community. Two groups that had different expectations for what a Fire Emblem game should be. And Intelligent Systems was well aware of the discourse, mostly because the same debate was being experienced firsthand by the development staff. Awakening was much more reliant on fan service elements with its support system, character designs, and self-insert characters. Some staff thought they should continue expanding those features to broaden the series' newfound appeal. Others thought differently, that Fire Emblem was a series that constantly evolved, and should continue to do so with strategic gameplay at the forefront. This resulted in a decision that seemed like the best of both worlds, to create a game that was about the choices we would make at the most decisive moment in our lives. In a world quite literally divided by two opposing forces, Fire Emblem Fates was the result of this. It wasn't just one game though, it was 3 different entries in the series under one banner: Birthright, Conquest, and the DLC route, Revelation. Some people have compared the multiple versions to Pokemon, but it's closer to the Zelda Oracle games if anything. Each game featured an entirely different story, set of maps, character roster, even gameplay differences. However, I've always viewed the 3 versions of Fates as one game altogether. I know that not everyone has that same perspective, but I figured I should just disclose that now, just so you'll know why I'm structuring this review the way that I am. As per what is practically tradition by this point, we switch continents to... Wait, again? This makes twice in a row now! How do you keep forgetting the name of the continent you're... whatever, on Fateslandia, the 2 most powerful countries are the Western Nor and the Eastern Hoshido. 2 nations with tensions so high they're only 1 plot device away from starting a war. But away from it all, deep into the land of Nor, resides the middle child of the royal family. That's Mew, by the way. Just like Chris and Robin before him, Corrin is also the My-Unit avatar for this game. Raised as a prince of Nor, Corrin lives his days isolated in a fortress away from any nearby civilization, forbidden to even step foot outside of the stone walls that confine him. Despite the horrid loneliness, Corrin has a great support group to keep his spirits high, not least of which being his siblings, 4 members of the royal family that come to visit him. On their most recent trip, good news is brought along with them. King Garen, monarch of the nations, then summons Corrin to the capital city, where his worth to the nation's military will be determined. In recognition for his dedication, Corrin is also given the Sword of Ganglari, which will be his personal weapon. Trials and tribulations ensue, which eventually leads to Corrin's first assignment, a scouting mission to examine the state of a supposedly abandoned fort near the Bottomless Canyon. Turns out the facility wasn't as empty as thought. Corrin plans to head back, but is captured by the Hoshidan army and transported to the capital. It's in that moment where Corrin meets Hoshido's queen Mikoto and the 4 royal children of the nation. Corrin's biological family. Wait, you mean to tell me that sociopathic king that locked Corrin inside a secluded fortress his entire life isn't actually his real dad? Oh no! Corrin also meets Princess Azura, perhaps the only person in the world who can truly empathize with his situation. Azura was once a princess of Nor, but was captured in retaliation for Corrin's kidnapping. She's reserved and enigmatic, giving off the impression she knows there's more to the situation at play than she initially lets on. To celebrate the return of the prince, a festival is held in the city square. But a mysterious man comes to take Corrin's Ganglari, using it to create a devastating explosion, causing many people to die. It's not a Fire Emblem game, unless your mom dies? Huh. Well, I guess I'll give him credit. That's a bold change of pace for a main Fire Emblem game to take, so... Wait, never mind, Dad's dead too. In a state of shock, Corrin's emotions get out of hand, revealing that he is able to turn into a dragon. Sure, why not? After the situation calms down, we see what King Garen is really after. The destruction of Hoshido, and to use any means necessary to make that vision become a reality. But Corrin is then gifted the legendary blade of Yato, a symbol of the one who will decide the fate of Fateslandia. Returning to the battlefield that he once dreamed of, he is reunited with his family. Both of his families, with each trying to persuade Corrin that it's them he belongs with. It's on that very battlefield, Corrin is forced to make his choice. 3 options are provided. Choosing Hoshido will activate Birthright, the route where Corrin fights his way to King Garen, and eventually putting an end to his dastardly schemes. Siding with Nor will begin conquest. In this story, Corrin discovers that King Garen truly isn't just, and works from the inside to make Nor a better place to live. The third pathway is that of Revelation. Intended to be the final story that players experience, Corrin sides with neither family, and instead forges his own path, investigating exactly what forces are at play, causing this war to begin with. It's inarguable that Fates is much grander in scope than Awakening. Intelligent Systems recognized that fans of the series weren't happy with how Fire Emblem Awakening's narrative played out, and the developers really wanted to go all in for the story. They commissioned Shin Kibayashi, a famed Japanese story writer that had his hands in multiple TV shows and manga. While only meant to draft a story concept and outline, Kibayashi turned out to be passionate for the project, and allegedly wrote around 500 pages. With Fate shaping up to have the best story in the series so far, fans only had one question when the game eventually dropped.
Why does it suck?
No one has really said exactly what happened with the original story. The most likely scenario being that Kibayashi gave way more than the team knew what to do with, and started cutting as many corners as possible to fit within the original scope they intended. If true, that would be the best explanation as to why the story makes as little sense as it does. Faulty event pacing, lack of details, inconsistent character motivations, and certainly less than even 100 pages of written content in the game. Okay, that last one was a bit presumptuous, but still doesn't feel substantial. Perhaps this would be less striking, forgivable even, if the story was created internally by Team Emblem's own writing staff. And as someone who can't read or speak Japanese, it probably doesn't help that I'm observing this story through an English interpretation, but what we have feels amateurish, especially after knowing that someone with such high renown worked on this game. Birthright is the most consistent of the stories, and perhaps the most traditionally Fire Emblem, journeying across the continent to fight an evil emperor, but it also feels sterile. It's a slow burn of a story, and the most exciting moments feel forced in, just because the writers wanted something dramatic to happen. Conquest has my favorite story of the 3 games, and believe me, I don't say that lightly. It has some of my favorite story moments in the game, and Corrin as a character is challenged in a way he doesn't go through in any other path. But at the same time, it's a story pasted together so poorly that the criticisms it's received over the years are completely justified. One of the most egregious examples in this game is in Chapter 18. Zola manages to capture the entire Hoshidan royal family. But no! The war can't end here! Defeating the opposition is the protagonist's job! So therefore, we will fight our own troops to free them and resume the war instead of getting the enemy to lay down their weapons because we've captured all of their rulers! Revelation starts the strongest of the 3 narratives. You start by getting answers to questions you've had playing the other 2 games. It feels good to finally get some resolution, and you can find comfort that the few mysteries it introduces will most likely be answered soon enough. The success of the story in this act is very short-lived. For the next few chapters, it's basically just Birthright again. If you aren't playing on some of the same maps in the game, then you're quite literally experiencing the same exact story beats. Once you get to the point where you start recruiting some Norian characters, the issues of Revelation start to solve themselves here, and the story actually becomes the most entertaining of the 3 narratives, until you get to Vala for the second time and all the momentum this game had comes to a screeching halt. Conquest Story gets more hate in the community, but I can't say in good conscience that it's worse than Revelation. The 2 other routes may have felt boring or nonsensical at times, but it never reaches the lows of Revelation's second half. Its big twist that it builds up the entire game comes off as more pathetic than shocking. It doesn't line up with the information we were presented in Conquest, and it barely even explains itself when it does happen. But the worst part is that after the fact, you move on like nothing had ever changed. Huh? Maybe it is a bit of an exaggeration to say that Fates' story is irredeemable garbage, but even after playing it recently, I can't remember most of it. There wasn't much here that emotionally resonated with me. I didn't really like the characters all that much, even with all the optional supports. Corrin is constantly challenged in all 3 routes, but his siblings still love him at the end of the day, despite not having learned a damn thing. The setting feels more like a means to an end rather than an actually living, breathing world. Honestly, I won't really bother going on. I don't think it's that worth complaining over. I don't even take issue with some of the other problems that the fans have with this game. Coming into it, I was actually getting ready to defend this story, believe it or not. I actually did enjoy Fates when it originally came out. I was thirsting for the chance to prove people wrong. And now that I played this game with analysis mode on, I find myself unable to do so. The most glaring flaw of Fates is that it lacks the commitment to fully believe in its own premise. Characters constantly remind Corrin, and by extension the audience, that war isn't something that is clear-cut black and white. That sometimes the only way to achieve peace is to keep a brutal fight going. And that sometimes the only reason you need to justify killing someone is so that they don't kill you first. These are the themes that Fire Emblem has explored in the past, but at the same time they come off as so much more superficial in this game. Azura makes a comment in Chapter 19 of Conquest that no matter which path Corrin took at the start of the game, it can't stop people from dying. If anything, I feel we can say this statement alone is the theme of Fates' narrative. And yet, this theme is completely undermined by the fact that there exists a third pathway where Corrin remains neutral and both kingdoms become friends and work together, with Azura even mentioning that this outcome was because of the choice Corrin made. It's never been outright stated that Revelation is canon according to Nintendo, but it's a ridiculous notion to think that it isn't. It's the route where all the heroes band together to fight the true villain that's been behind everything. It's the story that wraps up the most loose ends, and the one where Corrin's personal weapon is fully upgraded to the Omega Yato, the version of the sword he even uses in Super Smash Bros. It's not even the fact that I think the presence of a third pathway with the true ending of the game is a bad move. It's the fact that everyone seems to get their happy ending without it being earned. There's a chapter in Revelation where you fight an army led by Silas, and this might sound like a mean thing for me to say, but even when I first played this game, I was sincerely disappointed that he survived and joined the party anyway. Revelation was a good opportunity to kill off some of the teammates that were around in both Birthright and Conquest. And had more of these characters died in Revelation, that would automatically remove it as the definitive path to take by default. It would be blatantly dishonest for me to criticize the story in that way without bringing up that yes, there are characters that do die in Revelation. Yet they have such little impact. One of them was a death that was going to happen regardless of our intervention. One feels so forced that the only reason they did die is just because the writers knew they needed to fill a quota to check boxes. And the final one is actually fairly sad, but it's a character you're extremely unlikely to really know, and by extension care about. So unless you really do care about the deaths of these more minor characters, there's no reason to deny Revelation is the path most worth doing. But because these scenarios have to be paid for and played separately, it doesn't come off as working towards an ultimate goal. It feels more like a suit at either Intelligent Systems or Nintendo wanted there to be another product to sell, one to market to easily emotional fans that can't grasp the idea that they have to make a choice that will have consequences attached to it. To be clear, I don't think it's as bad as people say. There are certain ports to all 3 games I think is really good, but ultimately I did end up leaving disappointed. I'm willing to overlook some aspects of any story that are underwhelming, because I know I'm not as harsh of a critic as some of my peers. That being said, the greatest sin this story commits is betraying the whole purpose of its premise, and that is something I can't overlook. In the end, I'm not really all that upset though. I don't play these games for the story anyway, and there's something that this game gets right above all else.
Because Fire Emblem Fates has some of the best mechanics within the entire series to date.
Also, the soundtrack freaking slaps! Coming off of Awakening, Intelligent Systems had a lot to prove. Awakening wasn't inherently a bad game, but the game they did make hadn't complemented an engaging strategy game. So during the development of this game, Intelligent Systems took the base that made Awakening and blew the lid off everything! The first thing we have to talk about is the weapons triangle. No, it's not a new feature, but instead of being separated by weapon types, per se, it was separated by categories, and they were all color-coded. Aside from transformation stones, there were no weird exceptions to the rule, like bows, or in the case of Awakening, magic. This time, every single weapon in the game was effective against another type of weapon. This made every unit on the battlefield more threatening to, and more threatened by, another unit. In my opinion, this finally perfected the weapons triangle of the Fire Emblem series. But Fates even rebalances certain weapons to make them more interesting to use. Knives have been a weapon in the series ever since Path of Radiance, but I never mentioned them before because talking about them is about as worthwhile as using them. I mean, if the knives in these games were any weaker, they would actually heal your enemies. Fates is the first game in the series to bring knives back as a weapon since Radiant Dawn, but they made one huge change: not having it be a big deal if they couldn't do damage. Because knives have the added side effect of applying debuffs to the unit that got hit by them. This was huge! You could cut down on seemingly colossal generals. If you were examining a map and happened to find a platoon with a knife user, they suddenly became way more dangerous. While we're on the subject, Fire Emblem Fates pulls a guidance on us. Weapons do not break in any version of Fates. However, you still have 5 inventory slots to do with what you please. This allows you to think about inventory management differently. There is no need to have someone equipped with a spare of the same weapon, but you could have them carry different weapon types that are useful for different situations. But it's as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and in the case of Fates, that old proverb was multi-layered. Because while this was a fine change that some people may prefer over the old system, it does come with certain downsides. I still vastly prefer the method of weapons having durability. It requires you to be much more aware of what weapons your soldiers are carrying. I went into some of the final chapters of Fates forgetting that my soldiers still had their starting iron weapons. And since that's all you need to get by, it didn't incentivize me to go into shops to scout for better equipment. But unbreakable weapons does mean less time in menus, which sounds like a cool idea, but Fire Emblem is practically menu interactions the game anyway, so what difference does it really make? We can't talk about what this game improved without also bringing up its map design. Fates kept its map sizes small, but it learned from Awakening's bland and open environments. Way more levels in this game were populated with choke points and clever terrain placement. They certainly took longer to complete than most maps in Awakening on average, but still typically clocked in at less than an hour. Had this been the only consideration made, this would have been a substantial step back into the right direction, but Team Emblem still walked the full mile. During my first playthrough of this game, I smiled with glee when I saw their objectives that weren't rout the enemy or defeat the commander. Fates is the trifecta, an excellent balance between length, variety, and challenge. I think I might prefer the map design in Radiant Dawn slightly more, but Fates is a strong contender in engaging gameplay. And these maps were dynamic too. What makes Fates unique to every other game in the series are dragon veins. Found on nearly every map in the game is a spot where someone of royal blood can activate and change the battlefield in some way. It could be something simple, like creating a new path, but it could also make healing spots for allies, or block an enemy advance. Dragon veins and Fates are admittedly a little situational, or just downright gimmicky. I'm not below admitting there are times where they went overboard with the concept, like Hinoka. Freaking Hinoka! Ooh! In order to navigate these maps, you're going to need a strong team though. Seeing which characters you want to use in a Fire Emblem game is half the fun of them. And Fates introduced a small touch that made the decision much more complicated. In addition to the skills a character will get based on their class, everyone came with a unique personal ability. Whether that was doing increased damage to certain units, providing buffs to adjacent female units, or getting increased critical chances for forging a weapon with a really long name, these made everyone more unique. Intelligent systems fundamentally changed how pair-up works for Fates. Enemies have access to pair-up and all of its benefits too. This change alone would have made all the difference, but they took it a step farther. They separated pair-up into two modes. When units stood next to each other on the battlefield, they were in attack mode, and when units occupied the same space, they were in support mode. This means that units cannot attack and defend the unit they are supporting in the same fight. You can only have one or the other. Finally, they ditched pair-up being based around RNG. When in attack mode, your supporting unit will always go for an attack. Meanwhile, support mode will boost some of your stats, just like Awakening, but will also guard on set intervals when your shield gauge is full. Unit formations matter. If you wanted to defeat enemies, you had to figure out how to break through their forces. You can't pair everyone off at the start of the chapter, because that would limit your offensive options. But you couldn't exclusively rely on attack formations. If the enemy could exploit a weaker unit, your force would swiftly crumble. It added so many layers to the combat that you wonder how Fire Emblem battles were ever interesting beforehand. But after every story chapter and paralogue was completed, you still had plenty to do. The final addition that Fates introduces is My Castle. After you choose your route for the story, you have a plot of land to do with whatever you want. This is Fire Emblem's version of SimCity or Civilization. You can place buildings down to have somewhere to buy weapons, gather resources, battle your friends, or in the case of the Japanese version, pet your party members. I understand that this was removed from the Western release probably because it was too weird, but man, I just want to pet these cute girls. And the boys, too. My Castle wasn't the most deep thing that Fire Emblem had done, but it was a neat distraction that you might spend more time on than you realize. It can help you grow a bit of a deeper bond with your army, seeing them being the one to run the shops, harvest materials, or peep on them in the bath. You're right, I should stop this. But despite my praise, there are still issues that even the gameplay side of Fates does suffer from. And oddly enough, those criticisms come from the game feeling too much like Awakening. The most notable returning feature is the support system. It works just as it did in the last game, and that's A-okay in my book. I think that Awakening perfected the support system. Intelligent systems, feel free to use that system as much as you like. The options for supporting were a lot more pronounced and flexible than Awakening. And if you wanted to, you could frick your little sister, you perverted freak! On the subject of fricking, every aspect of the support system returns, and that includes child units. This is one of the more controversial systems that Fates kept. Genealogy of the Holy War and Awakening both had narrative reasons for why the child units did appear. Fates children are born in current time, but are sent to pocket dimensions to be protected from the war. Because I guess having your own plane of existence that you can rest at between chapters isn't safe enough. The catch is that time goes faster in these pocket dimensions, and that's how the children can be old enough to fight alongside their parents. Think Final Fantasy IV, and that should at least keep your brain from imploding. It does feel like a forced and highly illogical way to explain why they are here, though. Fates admirably wanted to provide some context for the player, and it didn't pay off. This explanation was highly criticized alongside Fates' already shaky narrative. If you removed everything about the child units being in this game, it would ultimately not be affected. I think that's why I never really went out of my way to recruit the child units in this game. Some of them are fine characters, but they just feel so forced in, especially when they are just reused characters from Awakening sometimes. Just because there is a marriage system, that does not mean children need to be there as well. A lesson that Team Emblem did take to heart for the next game. Still, those were just minor grievances in the grand scheme of the final product. Fates' problems weren't many, but what is present is a core issue that affects the entire foundation that was so solidly built. The biggest issue I take with Fates comes down to the way it's structured. Choosing a pathway was the central focus of this game. It was the moment that it builds up to and what the rest of the story revolves around. But this is a narrative choice that will have consequences for what game you'll end up playing. Depending on what route you took, you had a completely different experience to look forward to. In the past, I talked about there being two types of Fire Emblem games. I distinguished these by giving them the labels of classic and modern style. If you ever want to know what makes a game either one of these categories, all you have to do is ask one question. Do you have the ability to readily fight in optional battles? Fates is unique, since it's the only game in the series that is split between two styles. Birthright and Revelation both fall under the modern style by my definition. Conquest, however, is the only Fire Emblem game since Radiant Dawn to have ever attempted going back to the classic formula. In the modern pathways, auxiliary battles would appear in addition to the paralogs and invasions. Even if there weren't any available, you could spend money to scout for additional battles, cutting into your overall profits, but ensuring that there will be experience to earn if you need it. Conquest is the complete opposite. All the gold you'll find on your journey is all you'll ever get. And if you absolutely need more experience for the upcoming chapters, you could do the paralogs, but they scale to your level, making them a constant challenge at all parts of the journey. The question we now have to answer is, was this the right call? Perhaps what I'm about to say is going to be a bit of a hot take for some Fire Emblem fans to hear, but does forcing each game to have its own style of progression add anything to the overall experience? I wouldn't say that it does. In fact, I think that it actively hurts Fates. People have made complaints against games like Sacred Stones and Awakening that have traversable world maps, because Fire Emblem is a game series where every decision matters, and even experience distribution is one part of that. Since experience earned is a finite resource, you need to think ahead to have a rough plan for which units should be going into battle, and if you should keep your strongest units out of battle to pass that experience to a weaker unit that will become the next powerhouse. But the advantage of the modern style is that it grants a greater degree of freedom that even the best classic Fire Emblems can't hope to match. There's advantages to both playstyles, and which one you prefer as a fan of the series comes down to personal preference. Knowing that the fanbase was split between old and new, Team Emblem tried to come up with a compromise for the two types of fans they raised. I think their heart was in the right place, but I don't think they really thought it through. By trying to appeal to everyone, they accidentally made their product worse. Conquest is still an enjoyable experience, but I can't help but wonder if it would have been a better time had they just simply made it another modern Fire Emblem game. For starters, it opens up the game to more people of different skill levels, but it also allows for various playstyles. We could make the argument that auxiliary battles in the older games weren't entirely optional, but in Fates it's never been easier to gloss them over. The game gives you a drop-down menu to select the next mission as opposed to a world map. If you want to just play the game like a classic Fire Emblem, you could. With a game that also encourages building supports, it's baffling that Conquest is restrictive with how many support conversations you can get in a single playthrough. The modern, perfected support system of Fates ironically doesn't work in Conquest. Just having the option to grind I think would have made it even better. Otherwise, the only way I can see why they made this choice in the end is because this was another shady way of selling DLC to players who wanted a place to grind in Conquest. And Fates' route splitting is shady enough as it is. And sure, having the option for something still leaves the lingering temptation to use that opportunity. Some may say the reason Conquest is the best of the three routes is because you'll know that it was your sheer determination and tactics that saw you through to the end, not leveling your units to high heaven. But that's what difficulty options and self-imposed challenges are for. I didn't feel encouraged to build my team however I want, or even use smart tactics. If anything, when the going got tough, I did my usual strategy of hiding behind Xander and let him solo the game. And I could also make the same argument for Birthright. Honestly, why would I use anyone on the roster besides Corrin, Ryoma, and Xander? The Fates Royals are so stupid broken that it makes every new feature and fix of this game redundant. Pre-promoted units with ridiculously high stats, absurd ability skills, infinite weapon durability for their 2 ranged weapons that are also insanely good? Come on, man! All of Ryoma's critical quotes have been burned into the side of my skull since 2016 and they refuse to leave. I mean, at least when Ike gets Ragnell, you had to play the entire game to get it. In Fates, you get halfway through and it just gives you the win button. Why? Fire Emblem Fates is a game I feel very weird putting my thoughts together. The gameplay is fantastic, and I will value that over the story quality any day. However, when it comes to my thoughts on where Fates is in the grand scheme of Fire Emblem, it's on 2 different levels. On one hand, I do think this game has a basis for one of the best games in the Fire Emblem series. At the same time, the game cripples itself intentionally by not only splitting itself into multiple products, but also being restrictive in how people get to experience that story. I think the reason I'm able to look past those major flaws is that I'm one of the lucky people who actually does have the special edition of this game that includes all routes on one cartridge. And if Nintendo just made Fates a regular game for $40 that people could buy, I think there would be more well-loved in the community. When you charge full price for separate products, people are going to expect full effort to be put forth. Sadly, that isn't what you're going to get. I think people might have been more forgiving if they had all 3 routes of Fates from the get-go, or at least Birthright and Conquest if Revelations had to be DLC eventually. But I still enjoy this game, more than most it seems. I still think that Fates is an absolutely fantastic entry worth looking into. It's probably not in my top 5, but at least it's in the upper half of the series. It's still a game for fans to look into, but perhaps with a bit of caution and pace. Some people might be asking which of the games is my favorite, and like I said before, I consider all 3 versions to be Fates in its entirety. It's pretty hard for me to segregate them in my mind. But if you held me at gunpoint and forced me to make a decision, well, Birthright, I guess? It's the version I complained about least in the video, so sure, Birthright. With Fire Emblem Fates now completed, we can finally take it off the list. Meaning that the next time we'll be continuing the retrospective in this format, it'll be for the reason it was started in the first place. We'll be talking about Fire Emblem 3 Houses for the Nintendo Switch. But there is something I should disclose about the 3 Houses video, and that being, it's not going to happen for a long time. I estimate probably around spring 2020 at the earliest. So if you're just dying to know what I think about this game, well, I do have 3 videos already on the channel that you can check out now. So if there's some burning question that what does he think about 3 Houses? I go over my general thoughts and even spoiler discussions for the 3 routes I've already completed. So there's already that available to you if you just need to know now. But I'm still going to be making videos until then. Maybe some unrelated videos about games that have just been on my mind recently. Otherwise, we can talk about maybe the Fire Emblem spin-offs, or maybe a beginner's guide to the series for someone who's unfamiliar with it. If you have any other suggestions that you would want to see, feel free to comment those below, because I'll definitely take them into consideration if nothing else. And with that, my sneakily placed update video has been given to you. So thanks for watching the Fire Emblem retrospective for Fates, and I hope to see you next time, when we will be talking about the conclusion to the Fire Emblem series.